Good morning. Today, we're going to continue the Spiritual Adulting lecture series. However, this is sort of like a pause. Last week, we did age 42, and I linked it a little bit to 49 and 56, but there's a whole other series on the 48 to 52. So today, I'm going to stop, and we're going to do what I'm calling a spiritual STD, and this is the disease to catch. So let me share my screen. So here it is, spiritual STD, the disease to catch. And here I have the caduceus. I've explained this previously in other lectures, but today we're going to see it again and explain a little bit more about that. So the two laws, and there might be a little overlap with several laws, but two of the main laws today that I'm going to talk about are the law of gender and the law of octaves. For those of you who've been following my Dethroning Olympus series or familiar with the Enneagram, you'll know that this is the Enneagram symbol, and the way that Gurdjieff explained it is linked to the law of octaves. So you can see that there's shocks, specifically at the 3, 6, and 9, the DO, which are sort of new vibrations or potentials for new vibrations. And there's a lovely quote by Tesla who says, if you understand the lesson of 3, 6, 9, you know the answers of the universe, something like that. I'm sure that that's not exactly the quote, but he's referring to this metaphysical principle of law of octaves. And then the law of gender relates back to the caduceus and the balancing of the masculine and feminine. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. The mythology that we're going to talk about today is Hercules and the Nemean lion, Judas in the Bible, who was known to betray Jesus, and Ganymede that we briefly talked about in the age 42 lecture. We're just going to briefly revisit Ganymede today in today's lecture. So let me tell you a little bit about the myth of Hercules and the Nemean lion. So Hercules was given the labor to kill the Nemean lion, and as in many of these labors, these animals are destroying the countryside, and this was no different. So he was destroying the countryside, and he had to go kill the lion. And so he chased and chased and chased the lion. And finally, he realized that the lion would go into one door of the cave and come out the other door of the cave. And Hercules thought to himself, how am I supposed to catch him if I enter the cave and he's leaving out the other door? And this kind of reminds me of, maybe this is dating myself, the Flintstones. At the beginning of the Flintstones, you hear the song, Have a Yabba Dabba Do Time, and they talk about who's going to win the fight, who was going to stay out for the night. And it's Fred Flintstone chasing the cat, I think, and he's running in and out of the door and through the window. And that's what this is based on. So the same thing happens to Hercules, in one outdoor and out the other. And these things escape us. And this is in reference, and I'm going to break it down in a moment, to our personality and relate back to what the STD disease is that we want to catch. So what Hercules does is that he blocks one of the doors of the cave. And the cave is very symbolic. I've mentioned that before, and we'll revisit that today. But he blocks one of the doors of the cave, and he traps the lion in there. Now, Hercules is known for having a club, his handy dandy club. However, he cannot take the club into this labor. He must use his bare hands, and there's a lot of symbolism in that. And he goes into the cave, he kills the lion, and he takes off with his bare hands the skins, and he wears the skins on his body, and he comes out a victor, and he shows the all of the people of the village that he has indeed killed the lion. So that's a myth we're gonna talk about in a bit. Like I said, we're also going to talk a little bit about Judas and Ganymede. So the lion is the personality. Previously in the 42 lecture, I talked to you about Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guards the underworld. So the three-headed dog is our thoughts, our desires, and our emotions. Those are what keep us in hell. They're the first three truths on the spiritual path. And if we don't obsessively analyze our thoughts, honor the desires on that 48 to 52, that's 0 to 100, that we try to purify, or the lecture about, trying to sort of hide and pay a price for freedom to keep our impure thought, we can't really get into the higher levels of spirituality. And then, of course, emotion, that we need to understand what these emotions are from the shattering of the snow globe that keeps us in the fight or flight, that we don't think as adults or spiritual adults with the neocortex, or calling on Hephaestus for spirituality, if we can't get out of the vicious cycle of the emotions in the fight or flight. So from previous lectures. So today we're dealing directly with the personality. Now, we talk about sort of the child, which is exactly that, those unmet needs, the emotions, the desires, and the thoughts. Then we have a soul, and today is about the soul. Then we can speak about the spirit. Okay, so the soul and the personality are tied into. The soul is the essence. The soul is the clarity of the divine will, the divine spark in your body. However, it's muddied and it's covered. And I told you about the mansion in the Fisher King mythology that is guarded by snakes or guarded by filth, is that we have to start removing these veils, and we cannot get to a directed will, a directed soul here to create if we are sort of mired with thought, emotion, desire that we haven't looked at. So it's about peeling and peeling back these veils. So in this particular myth, lion represents the personality. Now he has to block and lock the personality, the cave, all these teachings. That's why it's hermetic. That's why they're kept in caves. All of these spiritual teachings and all of the spiritual work is done internally. It's the analogy of the chrysalis when the caterpillar turns into the butterfly. We don't see in nature the chrysalis. We see the caterpillar and we see the butterfly, but the inner process we don't see. The other day I was talking to a friend of mine about enlightenment, and I'm like, it's simple, the definition of enlightenment: chop wood, get enlightened, chop wood. And people have heard me say this before. On the outside, nothing looks different, but on the inside, your internal process, your total belief system has shifted and changed. And it's the same thing and the same notion of why Hercules had to go into the cave to defeat the personality, AKA the Nemean lion. So the personality is about hiding thoughts, desires, and emotions. And so the soul, or the divine will, your spark, cannot shine and cannot be divinely guided, your AKA your purpose here to create what you're intended to create, if it's covered by the personality. So those are the first three truths: the truth of thought, the truth of desire, the truth of emotion, AKA breath, which gets us out of the fight or flight and out of the emotion, so that we can get to this level of an understanding that this is our soul. Our soul has a spark of the divine. Our soul comes to create, and we're going to see the creator energy here. You cannot be a whole spiritual aspirant that directs his will clearly without unifying the three lower aspects of your nature. So in the 42 lecture, I showed you the glyph of Mars, which was a circle with an arrow. That symbol, let me show it to you here, has been misdirected as ego, as if this is a bad thing. So it's right here, the Mars glyph. This is the circle of spirit, and the arrow that we see again in Sagittarius is directed will. It's directed ego. It is our spirit that has a direction, our purpose. But instead, what we do is we overblow the masculine principle, because it is related to the masculine principle. We expand on that. We see this as sex. We see this as money. We see this as achievement. we see this as accumulation, as a go, 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 never a being, but rather a doing. And this is where we get confused in terms of ego being bad. If a spiritual teacher ever tells you that he or she has killed their ego, run. That is a false prophet. You cannot be in an earthly body without an ego. You can transcend at certain points. You can catch glimpses of the divine, and then you have to return right back into the body and continue the process. And this is a process of refinement, as the alchemists call it, from lead to gold. If you think at some point you have killed off your ego, you are wrong. That is impossible in the earthly realm. You need the ego. It is your soul being directed. However, most of us only use it as a personality, a mask that we wear. For those of you who like astrology, the first house or the ascendant is called the mask. It's talked about as the personality in the body. However, it is the point of consciousness in which consciousness enters the chart at a high vibration. So it's actually a sign we need to integrate that we don't integrate easily. We integrate the personality easily. We wear the mask easily, the thoughts, the emotions, and the desires. However, we do not raise consciousness easily. That is the purpose of the lifetime. And therefore, the point of the ascendant is to teach us how to raise our consciousness through that sign. So we're really constantly having to remember there's a low vibration version of everything and a high vibration version, a low level consciousness, a high level consciousness, an earthly consciousness, and a shamanic or spiritual state of consciousness. We have to remember this duality that exists. Today, when we talk about the spiritual STD, it's about unity, and we'll get there in a moment. So today is about the third chakra. Now we're talking about the fire element, the element that's the only element that can help us transmute. And in the law of gender, it is the musical note soul. And we will go a little deeper into that momentarily. So symbolism of this. The lion is directly related to Leo, the sign of Leo, which is the 5th sign in the zodiac. Again, you do not need to know astrology. These are just sort of to integrate all these different teachings. And here it is. It's a lion. It's the 5th house. So there's a lot here. In the 1st house, you get your personality that we have to unveil. We get our desires or our value system that's where we build our entire infrastructure that then blows up. We get our siblings. We get our rational mind in the 3rd, in Gemini. And we get the mass consciousness or the manger, the family, in Cancer. And we have to sort of understand that these are called the individual houses. The first 4 houses are the individual houses. This never changes, but we do have to transmute from this. And the first opportunity that we get to transmute is in Leo, is in this death of the personality. Now, for those of you who don't know astrology, the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th houses are called the personal houses. And then the 9 to the 12 houses are called the universal houses. So our individual nature, we have to keep coming back to over and over and over again to fine tune. But here is really what Jung would call the individuation process really begins. So this is where I have individuation. So here is when you start living your values. So you had to look at your values. You had to understand what values you inherited at conception, what you castrated at 28 to 30, how you castrated yourself. At 42, you blew that up in an attempt to live on your own values. But again, I go back to this. People do not know their values, and they don't know how to define and in measurable terms. And unless you can absolutely define in measurable terms your value system, you are still living as a child. You are not an adult, and surely not a spiritual adult. This is super, super crucial. And this is the opportunity that we're given. The 5th house symbolically is also the house of children. And it is not only earthly children, and I've been very clear that we are not here solely to birth children. That is our earthly duty to propagate, the generations. But we're actually here to create something from our soul, But we can only create something from our soul that is going to last and live a legacy if it is birthed on a conception story of wholeness. This is extremely important. Anything that has an origin story that is based on instability or lack of the law of gender, the balance of masculine and feminine, is going to die. It is going to be of an earthly consciousness. The only way to birth self, a book, a poem, an artwork, a speech that is going to have lasting value and a legacy, it's actually spiritual consciousness, is it must be rooted in the balance of the masculine and feminine energies, which we're going to talk about. That source of creation is this Leo. That source of creation requires you to look at your impure thoughts, your desires, your emotions, and the fourth is the mass consciousness, which was the low vibration at conception of your family. My guides like to say, you cannot have in the 10th house Capricorn the Christ consciousness if you are still living in the manger. The manger has to do with the constellation of Cancer. There's a cluster of stars called the Praecipe that in Latin actually means manger and is why Jesus was born in a manger. So we celebrate Christ in Christmas in December. That's not his birthday. He's actually a Leo. So it's the man that unified mind, body, spirit, that unified that lower nature and surpassed that lower nature, that then was the Leo, the sun, not S-O-N, but S-U-N, that then we celebrate in Capricorn as the Christ consciousness. And that's our same route to take, but this is the first step of it. So this is the first opportunity to birth ourselves. And again, obviously our earthly body dies. It's our spiritual consciousness that we want to reunite with the universal consciousness and stop coming back in the cycle of samsara, of death and rebirth, which is what Jesus represented with the resurrection. So this is our first freedom. This is our first attempt at real freedom, balancing the masculine and feminine. Remember, freedom is in the mind. It has to do with the thoughts. It's not a physical structure that limits you. Your oppressor is your thoughts. Not looking at your thoughts, not controlling your emotions, not restraining the desires. This is our attempt at self-love. It is only with self-love that you can achieve individuation, that you can achieve the balance of the masculine and the feminine energies. Other than that, you are not in balance. You are out of balance and you are diseased. We have to leave Cancer consciousness, the child. So the Cancer constellation is what's called a beehive or a honey pot. And try to remove a piece of honey from honey. It's practically impossible. In your earthly world, in your earthly consciousness, you need your family, you honor that, those traditions, fine. But in your spiritual consciousness, you need to raise the vibration from your earthly world, from that story at the moment of conception, from the animals in the manger. The animals is the low level vibration. Once you're able to extract yourself and leave the mass consciousness that Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount says, the wide door, and enter the narrow door, which is to understand your lower nature and try to rise above that by raising consciousness, then you're actually starting. And notice that this is called the personal sector of the zodiac. The individual is karmic. The individual is a low-level consciousness. The individual is what we have to continue going back to fine-tune via alchemy. But this is where the individuation process begins, self-love, the balance of masculine and feminine, and then you can birth something that will be according to spiritual consciousness or long-lasting or a legacy. So if you ever wonder why certain pieces of music or why certain poems or why certain literature pieces, that person was experiencing some version of this individuation process, this masculine and feminine balance, in which they created something that was now put into the universe as a perpetual legacy. Your children cannot be your legacy. They die just like you. It is something you leave for future generations. This is something that in psychology, we talk about generativity later on in Erickson's stages. And this is why we start volunteering or we want grandchildren. If we satisfy this from ourself, from our soul has done its divine will, and then we won't go into these depressions if we don't have children, grandchildren, or if we have later on, a lack of community or a lack of something, what we view as lack from an emotional standpoint, from a child's standpoint, because we've actually come and directed our will. This is also why some people choose to not have children, and they rather birth these masterpieces based on their masculine and feminine energies because they understand this principle, or maybe that's the way that their soul in this lifetime came to express its divine will or its soul. So the fifth house I mentioned starts the personal houses. This is where you actually begin to understand you're not a child. This is just the beginning. The opposite sign of Leo is Aquarius. Remember, the age of Aquarius, age 42. And now we're explaining a little deeper. That is when we assume and we stop with the toxic waters that start here in Cancer. We understand that toxic water theory is poor coping and trying to go back into the lower consciousness of the manger, the family. And it's not until Aquarius that we become the servant of humanity and service to humanity. And I told you about Ganymede and the balance of the masculine, the feminine, or the spirit and the matter. So here is when we begin to understand that we're not a child. Over here, we understand that we're equal to the universe. So this is just the understanding here that we're a child of no one. This does not mean that we actually understand it in our heart, but we have the knowledge in our head. Maybe the wisdom in our heart ends up over here once we're finally living as a service to humanity. So this is culminated in Aquarius, the opposite sign of Leo. Ganymede, I already mentioned, is union with the universal consciousness. But this is just the first step. We just left Cancer. We left the mass consciousness. We understand there's an individuation process. We understand we have to go and identify our thoughts, our emotions, our desires, our own value system. We attempt to do this at age 28. When we castrate ourselves and we're building, but it's just another perpetual building on our parents' values. Remember, at 42, we blow that up in an attempt to start this process. So here's my spiritual adulting map on the left, and this is one version, and there's many versions of the Tree of Life in Kabbalah. There's 3 pillars that you'll see in a moment with the Caduceus and linked to the STD. And the reason I bring this up, in a previous video, I showed you how we were building sort of the scale or the ladder. And I've shown you this before in mine, up, up, up. And that's sort of like our way up, even though obviously the universe isn't hierarchical for our eyes, so to speak, for form. We need to show it in this way to understand it. You'll see here, that is the sun, the symbol of the sun. I have it down here. It's the same symbol. We're going to talk about that today because that's Leo. Right above it is Aquarius, right here. And then right above that is Pluto, and I have that as well. I have Jupiter here, interfering, so to speak, and Mars. And the thing is that the child stays in the moon, the emotion, in the desires, and in the thoughts, the moon, the Mars, and Mercury. This is what sort of keeps us from identifying our true personality. I gave a lecture a while back about your moon sign and how it's like the veil that veils you, and it's your perception, and that's what you think everyone sees, although it's your moon, your experience in the womb, and your moon sign. And that your moon phase at birth is which one of your 8 lifetimes you're in. And that's going to help you understand sort of what you're going to do in your astrology chart in terms of what planets are going to sort of get in your way or are going to be sort of milestones that you need to hit. And that's very individual for everybody. But what we're trying to do is make a connection between leaving mass consciousness, Cancer, to the individuation process in Leo. This is just the beginning. This is the beginning, the beginning, the beginning. So that's why I keep saying, just because we blow up our life, just because we have a knowledge that we want some deeper consciousness or seek intuition or so forth, does not mean we're anywhere near achieving spiritual adulting over here. So the Kabbalah shows it as the sun in the center here in the Sephiro, in the center column, and it's right here. And then, of course, the same thing, Uranus and Pluto, just like I have, they don't do Chiron and Black Moon. They're using the original planets, and actually Pluto and Uranus are found later. But in this particular map, they're showing Neptune, they're showing Saturn, they're showing Pluto, and so forth. But Pluto's the last one, and actually in my map, it ends at Black Moon. So I just wanted to show that to you, that really this is the process. Leaving the mass consciousness, when you leave the manger, when you understand there's a low vibration and that you have a responsibility to direct your will to do the divine work you came to do, then you begin your process. This is just that first step. So this is the symbolism. This glyph is the sun glyph of astrology. I've talked about this before as the original sin, Jesus saying, missed the mark. This is also our inner spark. I gave you a lecture on the koshas and getting to the Atman, the soul, that divine spark. So I've said this in many ways. Today, I'm going to talk about the number 5. I've used the number 5 symbolism before in the Fibonacci lecture. The 5 is a number of spiritual growth. In my Dethroning Olympus workbook and model, when you calculate your family number, the number 5 is directly related to the fun, the spiritual, the person in the family or the child in the family. It's sort of responsible for the growth or the spirit or the fun aspect. That's part of numerology of the number 5. Number 5 is the number of the unified man. Remember, at this point now, we have understood our lower nature, our thoughts, our desires, our emotions, Cerberus, that 3-headed dog. We've understood that we come from a Cancer, low consciousness, low vibration manger of animals and animal consciousness. And now we've identified that we have a self, a divine spark, a will that has a direction, a purpose to do in this life. And now we are starting our personal journey. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why 5 is a number of spiritual growth. In the Fibonacci lecture, I showed you the curvature. So the other day I was having a conversation with a man and I said, oh, what year of business are you in? And he's like, oh, our 5th year. And I used the metaphor of the fruit. I said, oh, now your fruit is starting to have some curvature, some shape on your tree. And that's what's happening. We're starting our curvature of our spiritual growth. We're just starting that first little curve of that Fibonacci spiral that you see in a seashell or a pineapple. This is our curvature. So hence, obviously, the curvature of the circle. I've told you about the skinny cows that come Saturn every 7 years, our Valor years, our neutralizer years. And Jupiter at 12, when we realized that we could dethrone our parents, and every 12 years, so forth. And if you subtract the skinny cows from the fat cows, you get 5. And it's the number 5 that's responsible for that. So it's not the fat eating the skinny or the skinny eating the fat, but rather them together that build in increments of 5 our spiritual growth. The 5th commandment says, honor thy mother and thy father. And again, remember, the Bible, like all spiritual books, are metaphysical. It's about the 6th chakra. You have mother on the left pedal, father on the right pedal, and it's here, and we're going to see the caduceus again, where the serpents raise, you assume your throne, your kingdom, and you honor that your parents gave you life, the vehicle, and the value systems, but you raise above that mass consciousness, raise above that manger, raise above that low level consciousness at conception. You honor them by understanding that their story is your story, but you get to do it differently. And that's really the meaning of the 5th commandment. And this is also about balancing the masculine and feminine. Without the balance of the masculine and feminine, you cannot birth something that will leave a legacy. I've said before that many years ago, Shiva visited me and he said the most balanced act is pregnancy. Pregnancy is the most balanced act. First of all, because masculine and feminine energies, the egg, the sperm, were needed to make this creation. But what he was referring to was that the woman's body is in an active state, a doing, but it's also in a being state. And so it's when we manage and balance the masculine and feminine of the caduceus, those serpents, that reach up to the sixth chakra, which is the point of unity, where we no longer see duality. This is a difficult concept for a lot of people to understand, and what Jesus and Buddha both were teaching. There is earthly consciousness. You have to honor your earthly obligations. Do not blow up your life. Do not leave your marriage. Do not quit your job. Do not pay your bills in the name of spirituality. That is nonsense. There is a spiritual state of consciousness. Viktor Frankl lived this beautifully. In an earthly consciousness of a concentration camp, he was able to raise his consciousness and shift the perception, understanding what the spirit needed to learn from that example. That's our same life. So you may not like your job because of circumstances that happened during COVID, or your marriage has shifted. So not to say that you have to stay in the job or the marriage, but if you choose that, you live your earth consciousness, but you understand from a spiritual vibration, from a spiritual consciousness, the understanding and the lesson to extract there. That is living in unity. That is the STD, that the point of today is to catch this disease of STD. So it's only when we're living with the masculine and the feminine in balance, in unification, that everything else in the earthly realm almost seems okay. That's when we shift the perception. So we're dual. Yes, we are dual in nature. We've got a divine spark, a soul, and we've got an earthly body that will die. That's the duality. It exists. Mercury represents that. However, our job, as was Jesus's, Buddha's, and the spiritual aspirant's job, is to live in a unification, the law of gender, masculine and feminine, a third eye, understanding the spiritual consciousness, despite the duality of the earthly realm, the fact that this body needs purification and isn't a vehicle or a vessel worthy, so to speak, of the divine spark. But that's what we have. And understanding that duality and that unity is the entire purpose. So I love symbolism. So I have a few things here. So many, many years ago, I took piano classes when I was a little girl, and I used to have to do these solfège exercises, and I had no clue what that was, not a clue in the world. So of course, when I start on my spiritual path, my guides say that math, metaphysics, and music is the language of the universe. And yesterday I was at work, and one of our coding programmers showed a video of like these quantum string theory physicists talking about how the universe has a coding structure of like ones and zeros, just like a coding program. And as a metaphysician, I know this. This is the universal laws. And years earlier, I was presenting my Seven Gates book at Maharishi University. And there were some string theorists there talking about Ayurveda. It was an Ayurvedic conference, and how Ayurveda already spoke to the language of the universe and the and string theory. And in the Akashic Records, we know this, and Arvind Laszlo has talked about this, and Ken Wilber has talked about this, and a lot of these sort of transpersonal, astrologers or psychologists have spoken to this. And so all of that just fascinates me, and I just sort of see, all of it coming together. So what happens is when I start learning the law of octaves, and I learn it do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, which is exactly how I learned music when I was a little girl, I start realizing that the law of octaves speaks to certain things, of course, metaphysics, music, and mathematics. So in solfège, there are hand gestures, and the sol hand gesture, sol is a Spanish word for sun. It's the number 5 on do, re, mi, fa, sol, which is our spiritual growth. this is the hand gesture. This is a mudra. In Eastern philosophy, it's known as a mudra. And here's Buddha with the same mudra, which is the Abhaya mudra. And we see this in a lot of these Tibetan temples or Buddhist or Eastern philosophies. And it's the exact same thing as, even though it's not called a mudra and solfege, that you do, which is all of the elements in alignment. And that's the creation of the universe. So this is all the symbolism of the number 5, the creation of self, and pulling away the veils of who you think you are from low-level consciousness, thoughts, emotions, desires, and mass consciousness of family. And this is the first step. And everything in math, music, and metaphysics reaffirms this. Isaac Newton actually chose colors that he found a link to solfege and the pitch of the notes. And here is soul and blue. Blue has to do with the 5th chakra. So again, 5. And over here, this is the rays of creation. And we have our sun is in the soul. And it says mental body. And we know that the highest principle for us is all is mind. This is the Enneagram that I mentioned earlier, which was Gurdjieff. And he also speaks to the law of octaves in terms of the shocks when there's an opportunity for transmutation. And the 3, 6, and 9 in particular have to do with opportunities for transmutation. But here is the 5th as the soul. So I just love the symbolism of that. So individuation, Carl Jung speaks to this process. There's a wonderful book I particularly love by James Hollis, a depth psychologist, named The Middle Passage. I highly recommend it if you are seeking individuation process, maybe more psychological or depth psychology. It's a small book, but it's a very powerful book. Individuation is not do you boo or follow your bliss. I think Joseph Campbell must flip in his grave when he hears people say this. This does not mean blow up your life. This does not mean my needs are first before yours. This does not mean, oh, sorry, I've got to go, follow my journey and my path and you don't matter. And it's all about me. No, that's ego. That's the terrible twos. That's a total childish reaction. Do you boo is a way, or follow your bliss is a way for your ego consciousness, for your child consciousness to just do whatever the hell they want it to do. And that is not what this is about. So I just need to mention that. So I want to talk about Judas. Judas was in the story of Jesus, the one who betrayed him. And there's a term called apostasy. Apostasy is when you renunciate from your old life. I really like this particular picture because I see Judas here sort of like the shadow and Jesus sort of like the light. This is sort of the Cerberus, the 3-headed dog, the thoughts, the desires, and the emotions. Again, you have a body, you have a dual form, you have to pay your bills and use the bathroom and sleep and eat. That's just the nature. That's sort of like the dirt around the magical castle or the kingdom that I talked about in the Fisher King story. And then Jesus is the light. Jesus is the unified self, the masculine and the feminine. And I just love the way that this is portrayed. When we actually embark on a spiritual aspirant path, when we actually embark on an individuation process, this is what we do. We, in some ways, feel that we're betraying our first 4 houses of the zodiac, our personality, our desires, our values, our emotions, our siblings, what we learned in school, our mass consciousness, the manger, the emotions, the traditions of the family. This is why people cannot define and measure their value system, because then they would have to hold themselves accountable, and that would bring you into Christ consciousness, or at least begin the individuation process. So here they have Judas as the betrayer, and really what it is, apostasy means to renunciate your old life. Again, this does not mean follow your bliss. You do you, boo. I gotta go. I gotta blow up my life. I need a faster car and a younger wife. That's earthly consciousness. That is low-level consciousness. What this means is I have non-negotiables. What this means is I want to understand what our thread or what we're building together, what needs you want me to meet for you and I need you to meet for me. As I speak in The Truth is in the Triangle, if we're talking about couples, if we're talking about family, I've got the Dethroning Olympus workbook, which speaks to who does what in the family, what the expectations are, parents doing their spiritual work so their children don't have to do it for them. That's the renunciation of the old life. It does not mean leave your marriage, quit your job. And it's very irresponsible, a lot of New Age teachers that say that just because you're going to shift your vibration, that you have to change your external circumstances. That might happen, but that is not true. You don't have to throw away a 30-year marriage. Viktor Frankl couldn't leave the concentration camp, even though his obvious vibration had raised and his consciousness had raised. He was sort of in that reality. And so you get to decide that. So the you do you and the follow your bliss, if you opt and choose with free will, with conscious awareness that you're going to leave a relationship or a job or not pay your bills or meet your obligations or whatever that is for you, you have to understand the responsibility of that. There are responsibilities in the earthly and the spiritual realm that we're still called to, even though we're trying to individuate. But this is all about renunciating the old life, saying, I have a soul, I've got a divine spark, I'm going to direct it as per my soul's purpose. Individuation is not that I can simply just leave my earthly responsibilities. That's dissociation from the body, very naive and very child. So the illusion of an STD. STD means say, think, do. So I have it on the board. You have to say, you have to think, and you have to do. The only way to catch the STD, the only way to live in the law of gender, in the masculine and the feminine balance, in the third eye, in the unity, in the Christ consciousness. This is just the beginning. You still have many other steps on the path. But the first step to move out of that moon into the sun in the spiritual adulting map is that you must say, think, and do. So I get a lot of people that are like, oh, I have to do the right thing. I have to go see my father-in-law for his birthday. Okay, go and earthly do that. That is an absolute obligation that your earthly life requires. But what about the saying and the thinking? What about the two parts of that? If you don't say, think, and do, if you don't have an STD, what happens is you create karma, you continue to create karma, you're living as a child, you're living in conventional morality, the good girl, the bad boy, and you're not growing and you're not raising consciousness. You remain in the mass consciousness, in the manger, low-level vibration, just upon conception, same thing. Reasons why people don't want to leave the mass consciousness is because they identify themselves with that Costco membership. They'd rather have the Costco membership of the conditional limited version of love than seek the self-love that this requires. The first step in self-love is say, think, do, an STD. Without an STD, you cannot get self-love. Self-love is not crystals. Self-love is not lavender bath. Self-love starts in the third chakra by saying, thinking, and doing in unification, in unity here. In a moment, I'm going to talk about the third and the sixth chakra. We have to raise the serpent of illusion. I've talked to you about the illusion of the serpent. The serpent's representing the low consciousness, the low mind. We raise Kundalini. We raise the dragon in the Hercules myth of Hesperides. We raise consciousness with wisdom of the sixth chakra. And it has to be by saying, thinking, and doing all at the same time. That's where you get your Nordstrom's card. That's where now you are choosing where to shop, what to think, what to say, what to do. These are your values, defined and measurable, and you're moving in the world as the beginning of a spiritual adult. But you cannot start any individuation process. You cannot start any divine will, directing your divine will with its purpose, have anything that's worth creating if you don't start with the balance of the masculine and feminine energies from the sixth chakra, understanding you have to renunciate your old thoughts, emotions, and desires. Again, we never fully renunciate these. It's about finding that 48 to 52, that midpoint, which of course we have to identify what the impure thoughts are, what we're running from, etc., so that we can get there. And what happened with Judas? He called Jesus rabbi and revealed his true identity, and then they come and they take him to the crucifixion. We must reveal our true identity. Leo, the sun, the beginning of leaving the mass consciousness, the beginning of the individuation process, the beginning of shifting our consciousness, our vibration, the beginning of living in a unity and not a duality is calling ourselves out. What we think, what we desire, our emotions, that Cerberus three-headed dog that's keeping us imprisoned, our oppressing thoughts, emotions, and desires, and reveal our true identity. Only then can we be balanced, can we begin the individuation process, can we start the spiritual sort of journey, and can we start living in a true identity so that others will know that we say, think, and do cohesively. So the spiritual STD, say, think, do. This is the trick. Most people don't. I hate my father-in-law. I don't want to go visit him, but I will do it because I'm a good girl. I'm thinking about how many ways I can get out of it. I say I'm going to be there at 6, and I do get there at 6, but the thoughts that brought you there are creating so much karma. Your thoughts, your impure thoughts, your dirty, filthy thoughts are creating the world in which you live in. And then you complain, but you don't want to look at the impurity of thought. Step 1 on the 12 truths is the truth of thought. Hercules failed at his first labor, and he failed at his 6th labor. We constantly have to look at our body purification, and we constantly have to look at our thoughts. This never ends. This is forever and a day until we take our last breath, part of being a spiritual aspirant. There's no way around it. So you may get to work at 6 p.m. as required. You do it, and you say that you're going to do it, and you do it. But if you think all the way to work how much you hate your job, then you're living in the mass consciousness, the low vibration, the ego, the personality, and you're not in divine will. You haven't renunciated the old life, and you haven't begun this process of individuation. Now, this is the caduceus. I told you that this is the symbol of Mercury. Mercury wears winged sandals to keep up in the upper world and the lower world, and fails to be here now. Our thoughts are what fail to keep us here now. Yes, we're here now in the body, and we have to be at work at 6, and we show up, but our thoughts are not there. We can see when we talk to people, our thoughts are off somewhere else. We're thinking about our rebuttal. We're never present with the person. All of this keeps us in the mass consciousness. All of this keeps us in low vibration. All of this creates karma. All of this creates the filth of the world. We are not individuated unless we're saying, thinking, and doing, and we can calm the vrittis, the thought process of the mind, and balance the serpents. Serpents are always illusion. So one is the right, which is the Pingala. The left is the Ida, the masculine, the feminine. Unfortunately, as I said before, the masculine has been what has been prioritized in this society, and the feminine has failed to sort of rise side by side. When you honor thy mother and thy father, the masculine, the feminine, the law of gender, they meet at the 6th chakra. That's where you assume your throne, the void of the universe. That's where you dethrone your parents, but yet mom and dad are on either side as the lotus petal. That is when you live in spiritual state of consciousness, unified, and you still remain in the body, health, as the dual consciousness, that your spirit and matter, and you have to honor both. And you don't live negating your desires, but understanding that the body has desires. So this brings me to the link of the 3rd and the 6th chakra, which is on the way to STDs. The masculine and the feminine, I told you, the Ida and the Pingala serpents as they meet here in the sixth chakra. The third chakra is the fire chakra. It is the chakra of self. It is the chakra where you digest and metabolize your thoughts, your desires, and your emotions. If you do not stop and transmute them with the fire element, identifying your impure thoughts and purifying them, not because you're paying a price with the sacrifice. Like I said the other day, the bully comes to pay and he wants more than your lunch money, but that you digest and metabolize where the judgment came from, where the value came from, where the thought came from, and you do that inner process continually, then you can have healthy digestion in terms of strong Agni according to Ayurveda, or in functional nutrition, a really strong, third chakra or gut. If not, if you don't sit and look at what you're digesting and metabolizing in terms of your thoughts, emotions, and desires, then you can't have a strong digestive system and you can't achieve the unity at the sixth chakra. You have to understand what you've done, what you do, how you trick yourself playing psychological musical chairs, so that you can digest all of that experience in the third chakra. So these are directly related. This is the self-worth chakra. In the sixth chakra of unity, the snakes have met. So you're living in the lower nature, that you have a body that has bodily needs and money and sex and poop and sleep. But as a spiritual consciousness in the individuation process, you're now masculine and feminine are balanced, honoring thy mother and thy father in terms of the energies, not your actual parents. You start the STD. You start, say, think, and do as one, and you remove the illusions and the veils. This is how you start this process. So my question to you is, where do you say and do, but think opposite? In the name of the right thing to do. This is conventional morality. I've talked to you about Kohlberg. If you stay in the good girl or the bad girl or the good boy or the bad boy, then you're just in conventional morality. You're simply a child. You are nowhere near adulting and much less spiritual adulting. So you have to get very clear as to when you show up to a situation, whether it's a conversation or planning an outing with someone, where you're saying, thinking, and doing in unity. And where are you selfish? I've told you there's self and there's selfish. There's no such thing as selfless. If, and I don't think I'll see that in my lifetime, the age of Aquarius goes as planned and we all become world servants and we can actually be like Ganymede and nurture others as others nurture us, and we can live in that agape love in the fourth chakra. If that exists, then perhaps selflessness exists. We are very far from that. So where are you selfish? Where do you take someone's power? You take someone's power when you jump in and you do something for them in the name of selflessness. Parents do this with their children. So they don't allow them to grow up or have their own responsibilities, find their one forbidden thing, so to speak. Okay. And where do you have self? Self is when you are on your throne and you let the other be on their throne. When you own your 48 to 52 and you let the other own theirs. This is where we have boundaries and limitations. This is the purpose of the rule book, the non-negotiables, in the I and the we, when everyone gets to show up as self and simply identify the one need that they're perhaps going to meet for you, what the purpose, the thread of the relationship is. But we don't have these adult conversations because we want to stay in child, and in the name of selflessness, call it selfless when really it's selfish. So this is the homework. And I invite you to look at where you show up, doing and saying something, but think different, and where you take someone else's power or you let someone take your power in the name of selfless. So STD, spiritual STD, you definitely want to catch this disease. Have a lovely day.